welcome everyone to the Dole Institute virtual post-election conference. Our guest for this hour is Mike Glassner, who's a longtime friend of mine personally and longtime aide to Senator Bob Dole. Has been working on the president's reelection campaign. Mike, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for including me.
Yeah, glad you could join us.
Great to be with you.
You were in our post-election conference representing the president's campaign 4 years ago and had a major role then. Can you tell us what you did between the last campaign and this campaign?
Sure. So I think this is one thing I tell to people who have been involved in presidential campaigns previously is that, you know, President Trump, Mr. Trump, then President Trump kind of remade the model about how presidential campaigns are run in many ways. One of the most, I think, remarkable ways is that he really typically, as you know, Bill, presidential campaigns, when they end, are wound down. The bills are paid, there's legal work to be done, but for the most part, past incumbent presidents have ceased their operations for the most part. All the operations or the political activity is shifted to the White House or to the national parties. And, you know, typically you have a very small group of people who kind of pay down the bills. And then after the midterm elections, the campaigns are then restarted. Well, this president did things much differently, as he has done in many ways. So shortly after the 2016 campaign concluded, the president-elect and his family came to me and asked me to continue working on his political committee. So in fact, we filed the paperwork for the president's reelection committee on January 20th, 2017, on inaugural day. So in this case, there was really no gap between the first term and then starting to run for the second term. I think this will be a model that all incumbent presidents will probably have to follow in the future, primarily due to the enormous amounts of money that are now, you know, required to run for president. Just the campaign committee alone in 2020, we raised and spent over $1 billion. So and that does not include the Republican National Committee and the outside affiliated committees. So if you think about that amount of money that's now required, or probably, you know, will be, it sort of demands that presidential campaigns are run for 4 years. And I expect to see that in the next cycle too, in some way, shape, or form. So in any case, I stayed at Donald J. Trump for President, Inc. And as a matter of fact, I've worked there continuously for 5.5 years, which I'm told by people who have done the research is the longest that it's ever been done by anyone. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but I was also the sole survivor of anyone who started on the 2016 campaign and completed the 2020 campaign. So I am that man. Again, I don't know if that makes me smart or dumb, but it's what I did. So we had a, I guess to answer your original question, we had a staff that remained in Trump Tower in 2017 and 2018. And we had a very robust communications platform that continued to operate throughout that period. And we supported the president's campaign activities in the midterm elections in 2018. So we continually raised and spent money, which in retrospect may or may not have been a great idea if you looked at where we ended up in October of 2020. But we did have a very robust fundraising, travel, and communications strategy that we continued throughout the midterm period until when we sort of relaunched the reelection committee in 2019. So I've been working on a presidential campaign for a very long time.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that is very, as you say, very, very unique. Tell us what your role was in this particular presidential campaign.
So in 2020, so I was, you know, again, I mentioned I had been asked to, you know, keep the doors open, keep the machine operating in the midterm cycle. And then in 2019, early 2019, Brad Parscale, who had been a long-term digital strategist and advisor for the president, was named as campaign manager. And I took the title of Chief Operating Officer. So my day-to-day activities did not really change that much. But I retained responsibilities for the day-to-day operations for the campaign, such as it was in 2019. It grew continuously over 2019 and 2020. But my primary responsibilities were to coordinate with fundraising, oversee budgeting, personnel, the physical operations of the headquarters. Scheduling in advance was actually one of my primary responsibilities, the production of the Trump rallies, and to handle just all day-to-day operations, as it were. And the campaign manager was really more focused on managing the digital and polling and sort of maintaining communications with the White House. And he also was responsible for producing digital and broadcast advertising. So we had, sort of distinct responsibilities, but mine were pretty much the same as they had been for the previous years, which is operational.
Okay. Now, going into the South Carolina primary for the Democrats, the economy was booming. The Democrats looked like they might nominate Senator Bernie Sanders as the president's opponent. Mm-hmm. How did the campaign assess the president's chances at that point in time?
Well, I was talking to a colleague about that this week. So if you break sort of the reelection campaign down into phases, there was the midterm phase that we just discussed. Then there was the pre-COVID phase, which I think is 2019 and then early 2020. So if you look back at that time, the economy, was outstanding. As the president said, it was the greatest economy in the history of the world. But unemployment was extremely low. Stock market was extremely strong. Hispanic and Black unemployment were at historic lows. So he was right. The campaign was riding very high at that time. Our fundraising was very, very dominant and very effective. So we all felt very, very confident in the president's reelection. That what had been occurring in the Democrat primary was also very heartening to us. There was a lot of conflict between the wings of the Democrat Party, right? The more liberal and progressive wing is personified by Sanders, and then the sort of the mainstream establishment wing that was Biden was the complete embodiment of. So, this kind of civil war that was going on inside the Democrat Party, we also saw as advantageous to us at that time. And our presumption had always been that Biden would become the nominee. I think he had been the front runner, in most polls for quite a while by the time he hit that primary. I think that there had been, the Democrat establishment was somewhat terrified that Sanders was getting some traction during that period. And you saw them coalesce around Biden, which again was no surprise to us. It was sort of what we had expected. And frankly, we welcomed, because although the Democrat establishment was behind Biden, it was our, view that he was a weak candidate and had a lot of baggage from the past that would come back to haunt him. So we weren't, terribly distressed by the emergence of Biden as the nominee after the South Carolina primary.
Well, then the pandemic hit. What was the immediate reaction in the campaign to the pandemic?
Well, the first thing we had to do was radically restructure our operations. So we made the decision very early on to close the campaign headquarters entirely. I think we did that, quite early. The Biden campaign headquarters had never really fully opened in Philadelphia. I mean, not for the general election, but we had a fully functioning, very large headquarters in Roseland section of Arlington, Virginia, a building that, we had leased the previous year. And we're preparing to grow, and we had leased, a significant amount of space in anticipation that our headcount would go up, which it eventually did. Actually did quite a lot during the pandemic period. But we immediately had to switch to a virtual campaign. So that was a major challenge logistically, was to make that decision and then figure out how to make sure that we could continue to function, particularly from a comms standpoint. So we immediately put together a kind of a virtual organization based on silos around the divisions that had been operating in the headquarters. And then we did a lot of, like you and I are doing now, we explored the era of the Zoom call, and we had a lot of them all the time, all day, every day, to communicate as best we could. So, one of the major challenges of that period was, the Trump rally is really a political phenomenon that had dominated, politics for several years up until that point. One of my responsibilities was producing those, and we had, I think, an excess of, or almost 600 of them leading up into that time in all the major, arenas all over the country. Yeah, our total number was 642 at the end of this election that we had produced. So, those were no longer possible, obviously. So the one thing we did start ramping up was our online show. So Laura Trump, who's the president's daughter-in-law, Eric Trump's wife, had become a very, very effective spokesman and kind of the star of the Trump online show. And so the first thing we did was start ramping up the production of online programming on the website, which turned out to be highly, highly successful. As a matter of fact, we averaged, 1 or 2 million viewers per show on a consistent basis.
Wow.
Over a period of, during that entire period. It actually worked quite well. But that took a high level of coordination and testing to kind of figure out how to produce them all, remotely. We had to build studios at different places in the country where we knew the productions were going to take place. And then we had to coordinate the production of that, over wide areas. So, and book guests and get it all online. But we did figure out how to do that in a relatively short period of time. And it turned out to be a very highly successful sort of a stopgap measure during the pandemic period to continue to have our communications platform operating to support the president's messaging that was coming out during that period, and to try to keep our, our base fired up. And it was, fairly successful given the circumstances, I think.
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about, Mike, what the campaign saw as the president's pathway to victory after the pandemic hit and after it became apparent that President-elect Biden would be the presumptive nominee?
Yeah, well, that, like everything in this entire experience, there's kind of two different ways to look at strategy, right? There's this typical way, which is a bunch of smart people who, supposedly know what they're doing, sitting around an office in the headquarters and coming up with a roadmap that was going to be followed. Right? That's kind of the traditional model. The Trump model was that the president is the communicator in chief. He's the chief strategist. He made all the decisions about what was going to be said and done. So, that held true for the entire 5.5-year period. And it was definitely true during that period of the, COVID messaging. I mean, one of the things that was really challenging about that period, we mentioned this when we mentioned the pre-coronavirus, the pocketbook issues were extremely important. The economy was improving, but there was kind of a lag. But if you look back into polling we did, public polling in February and March, there was really overall, there was a very optimistic and positive feeling about the direction of the country. The plurality of the voters in polls said that their personal finances were improving, and that was reflected in the president's, our internal and external polling numbers. At the same time, Biden was really going through that meat grinder of the Democrat primaries, and, they were doing all the debates, and, it was fairly brutal. It's easy to forget, all the kind of the attacks that were made on Biden during the debates, but they were fairly harsh, and they're ongoing. So, when the coronavirus period commenced, it was really challenging. Not only could we not, conduct our physical campaign the way that we had for years prior to that time, we kind of went into this suspended animation, if you will, of the online campaign as best as we could, and continued to try to raise money through, digital and high donor Zoom meetings. I'll talk a little bit about fundraising later. Maybe we can, about our digital fundraising. That's really what sustained us through the period. But, the economy, then everything that we had based the premise of the reelection campaign was our strong economy kind of went off a cliff, right? The unemployment numbers went up very quickly in a very short period of time, and a lot of time was spent at the campaign about how we're going to deal with that. So if you look at, again, if you look back at the end of the first wave, the end of April, the beginning of May, there was a talk about, the economy was, slightly improving. Some of the unemployment numbers did improve, but there was always a fear that there was another spike coming. And, you know, that kind of the cycle we saw was that the gains that the president was making in the polls would then be offset by a spike in the virus or rising numbers in the virus. So it was kind of a very frustrating to try to get, you know, footing in that atmosphere when the numbers, you know, the president would talk about an improving economy and improve, you know, better unemployment numbers, and then the coronavirus numbers would spike and really offset that. So that was really hard to get out, you know, consistent messaging during that time with so much uncertainty.
How did the racial justice protests after the killing of George Floyd affect the campaign and the campaign's overall approach?
That was really a major, you know, turning point, and I think it really impacted, you know, both campaigns, you know, fairly significantly. Like I went back and looked at some of our polling numbers during that period, you know, and what you found is that, like, the numbers, you know, the polling numbers was like 85-10, you know, with about among the Democrats about, you know, racial injustice or systemic racism, you know, defunding the police. And then the flip side of that was that, you know, the disregard for the cancel culture and the protests and some of the violence that took place in the street. We had similar numbers among Republicans of their disregard for that. So there was this, you know, there was a major cultural split that was taking place between our base and the Democrat base, and then whatever persuadable voters were left, you know, we were left to try to persuade them one way or another. And it was very difficult to do because it was a very small number. It was very hard to define, and it was hard to target them and try to move them, you know, towards us during that period. So obviously that was a very, very difficult period. Again, we had not yet been able to engage sort of on our traditional campaigning. The media was dominated, you know, by these events that were taking place, and it was very difficult to push back against that from a political standpoint. You know, the president did, you know, land on a message of law and order that we found to be quite effective. You saw that it was reflected in our broadcast and digital advertising, the strong law and order message, which I think, you know, ultimately was successful. He was really able to, in many ways, particularly with our base, kind of push through the negativity that the mainstream media was, you know, attributing to him, these events, which, you know, they were really locally based, and the governors of each state, as we, you know, now know, really had a lot to do with how the COVID restrictions were impacting that, and the police that were in activity around that. So in any case, you know, I think he was fairly successful in kind of pushing through a law and order message that was able to counter a lot of the negativity that was coming out of the activity in the streets.
Okay. You talked about earlier and gave some really compelling statistics, the importance of the rallies to you. You kind of started back up in Tulsa on June 20th, had a much lighter crowd than anticipated.
Yes.
And then about a month later, Brad Parscale was demoted.
Yes.
Was that basically a result of that poor attendance?
I think it was like that. I think that was one of the issues. I think there was also recognition, you know, by the president and the family that our ground game was really, really important. Like, in particularly Tulsa, I think Tulsa was a major factor. I can get into details about why that turned out that way, but I think that there was a widespread recognition that our primary strength, one of our major strengths, was the field force that we had spent hundreds of millions of dollars building over several years. And then that was contrasted with the Biden team's decision to not do traditional door-to-door or get out the vote, turn out the vote campaigning, right? So they made a decision that they were not going to do, you know, the traditional voter contact. And the RNC and the Trump campaign made the decision that we were going to do that. So I think that was another one of the major, you know, reasons for the change in the leadership. Bill Stepien is a field guy, had been, you know, performed that role in previous presidential campaigns, really knew it extremely well. So I think that he and Justin Clark, his deputy, were brought in to really try to exploit that advantage that we had. So I think there were a lot of reasons why, Brad's role was changed, but I think the events and the demands of the campaign and the changing kind of priorities were another part of that. Brad is an extremely smart person. He's probably a genius when it comes to digital operations, fundraising, persuasion, targeting. And that was really where his focus had always been. And I think that, the events in Tulsa kind of sped up what probably would have been a natural process of having a more field-based expert in the campaign manager's seat.
You talked, as we said, about the importance of these rallies. How concerned were you and other people in the campaign about doing the rallies during a pandemic?
Well, there was a lot of concern about it. I mean, I think I talked about the Trump rallies in the, when I was at KU following the 2016 campaign, but that was really something that emerged very early on in 2015 as the president's primary communications platform. Really came to dominate particularly local news, and then the national news in a lot of ways. When you think about these events, 600, in excess of 600 of them, they were all live television broadcasts, which is no easy thing, but we really did perfect that. And it really became the basis of the Trump campaign, both 2016 and 2020. There was many kind of unseen benefits that were driven out of the Trump rallies. Is how we collected the data that became and turned into the largest, voter contact operation in history. We also used it to develop our donor database. It dominated local news. We got earned media before, during, and after the event. It gave the president a platform to talk on the national, many times the national live broadcasts. So, so it had multiple kind of complexities that were all accrued, positively to the campaign. And when it became clear that we could no longer do that, it was obviously a major, major problem. So, we attempted the one in Tulsa. I think there were a lot of reasons why that was not optimal. There was a lot of uncertainty at that time. There was a curfew put in place by the mayor the night before. There were a lot of factors. But we always knew, even after that and going forward, that we were going to have to figure out some way to do in-person rallies because that was really the president's primary platform. It was the way that he communicated, and it was his favorite thing to do. I mean, that's really what he loved. I think one of the things he probably loved most about the presidency was the ability to perform at these rallies, and it had tremendous benefits to us. So we knew that they were going to have to be outdoors. We had a lot of success in the past doing airport rallies. It's been a standard, Bill, as presidential campaigns since the invention of the jet, right? I think Nixon was probably the first one to do it, and it's been done by every presidential campaign since then. We did it. We used that format a lot in the 2015 and 2016 campaign. There's a lot of advantages to it. There's a lot of disadvantages logistically. I mean, airports, tarmacs and airport hangars are not made. We're not built for 10,000 people to show up. They usually have 10 parking spaces, not 10,000. So they have virtually no infrastructure, right? No broadcast capabilities. Air Force One, just moving Air Force One around is extremely complex and takes a lot of support. So we knew it was going to be hard to do, but it immediately became clear that that was really the only format that was going to be possible, that was going to be outdoors, that, we could put in place mitigation factors, temperature checks, and other mitigation we did to try to keep people as safe as possible. But we knew we had to do it, and that the president wanted to do it. So that format is really what emerged as the most effective one. And we found it to be really quite effective. We had, once we recommenced the Trump rallies in the late fall, they were all very effective. We had as large crowd sizes as we had ever had inside the arenas. And it provided the same, set of advantages to the president, which was his ability to dominate the media, to drive out his base, and to, collect data.
What was the campaign's assessment of the virtual conventions? Not just kind of the bottom line political assessment, but also what were some of the challenges in doing a virtual convention?
Well, we could probably talk an hour and a half about this cycle's convention alone. I had been asked by the president to serve on the site selection committee representing the campaign. That was back in, I think, 2017 or 2018. I'm not sure when we started that process, very early on to pick the site for the 2020 convention. So I can remember, we met with officials from several cities. We did not know then that it was going to be a very campaign. Went through the standard processes of, visiting sites and meeting with elected officials. And I can recall very clearly when we met with the mayor and police chief and others from the Charlotte Convention Visitors Bureau, when they made their pitch to do the convention, it was very impressive. Like the Charlotte delegation they had done the convention with President Obama in 2012, so they had a very recent experience of having done it. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew what the Secret Service requirements are. Charlotte had really grown as a city. The arena was great. The hotels were great. So, the Charlotte, again, I have a lot of respect for the mayor and the city officials that agreed to have the Republican convention. At the time, the political risks of doing so were quite high, but they did it anyway because they agreed to do it because they wanted to all the benefits that come from conventions. You know what they are. They spend off millions of dollars. It's a great showcase for the city. So in any case, we went forward with Charlotte and had gone through the entire process of raising many millions of dollars for the host committee in Charlotte. Good friend of mine was the chairman of that finance committee, and had been working very effectively to raise the money, and it had been going very well. There was a full-on committee on arrangement staff, was in Charlotte on the ground, hundreds of people. So, Charlotte, we were very, very optimistic about Charlotte. But then, again, that was the pre-COVID period. Then we hit the post-COVID period, and it became clear for a lot of reasons that having an indoor, large-scale convention in Charlotte was going to be problematical. The governor of the state in particular, Roy Cooper, was not enthusiastic about us continuing there with the convention. He made that very clear, very publicly. And, there was local officials also were, losing a lot of their enthusiasm for it because, the ban, I think the ban at that time was 250 people or 25 people, I don't remember, inside a convention hall. And again, the president also was losing enthusiasm about doing an event, with 25 people in the room when he had been doing 25,000. So, for a lot of reasons, it became clear that Charlotte, North Carolina was not going to be an option for a typical, in-person convention. So, there was a school of thought that, different states were having different experiences with the pandemic at that time. Florida had a much different approach to how they were dealing with the pandemic. The governor, DeSantis, was very friendly, was a big supporter of the president. He and the mayor of Jacksonville were willing to host an in-person convention. The numbers were much lower there than they had been in Charlotte. There was a thought that we could do it very safely there based on the rules that were in place for both Jacksonville and Florida at the time. So we went there. We looked at all their facilities. They had a terrific arena that we had done actually 2 Trump rallies in the same site, so we knew it well. Downtown Jacksonville had a lot of hotels. It was really actually, considering the short time frame we had available to put on a convention, it was actually very, very favorable set of circumstances. In particular, the mayor was had been a very early Trump supporter. And they have a unified government there, the city and the county. So he really had control over all the government entities. So Jacksonville actually emerged as a very, very strong and seemingly possible option for the convention. But as the time drew nearer for the scheduled convention, it became clear that many of the same kind of weaknesses and problems with the coronavirus numbers were starting to reflect what had happened in Charlotte. And so after a period of time, it became clear that that was not going to be a possibility to do it in the arena in Jacksonville. We actually looked at, Jacksonville has amazing facilities. They have one part of downtown that has I think it's a 15 or 16,000 person arena. It has an NFL stadium for 60 or 70,000, has a minor league baseball stadium for 8 or 9,000. It has a very large outdoor amphitheater. So we even, for a period of time, we even looked at doing it at this amphitheater. You could have staged a show there with a live audience outdoors. But again, it became obvious that none of those options were really going to be viable given the coronavirus and the pandemic was continuing to spike up at that time. So I think I recall that the Democrats made a decision. They announced that Joe Biden was not going to go to Cleveland and that their convention was going to be virtual. And then the president certainly thereafter announced that that our convention was going to be virtual also. So we had so now we're on our third round of trying to plan a convention in a very short period of time. I believe we had something like 3.5 weeks and I was very much involved with planning what became the final format of the convention, the virtual convention. So, we had a lot of ideas, some of which was to do, virtual events all over the country in different markets. The logistics of that became overwhelming in such a short period of time we had available. It soon became apparent that really the only way it was going to work is if we did it in the DC metropolitan area, where we could get our speakers, our production crews, all the required infrastructure in a very, an immediate area that was, controllable and was accessible and affordable. Working very, closely in concert with the RNC, we quickly came up with a format and some sites that we thought would work very well that were in the immediate DC metro area. The three primary sites that we settled on was the Mellon Auditorium, which Bill, you may remember well. We did the salute to the leader there back in the day, very successfully, beautiful place. I'd known it from, using it for that event, and I advocated that we could relatively easily convert that into a very large scale soundstage, which is in essence what we did. So we built a scaled down version of what would have been a typical convention stage. We had an excellent production crew that we were able to put together that, put in the necessary sound mitigation, lighting. They really did an excellent job of building it out to look like a stage at a convention. We also, at the vice president's direction, we staged his speech at Fort McNair, which is nearby in Baltimore Harbor, which was then accessible and was relatively easy to set up as a stage. And then the president also directed us that he would be giving his speech outside on the south lawn of the White House. Again, there had been some precedent for convention activity at the White House. Nothing had ever been done on this scale. There was a lot of controversy about, staging a political convention event at the White House. But the White House lawyers signed off on it. Apparently, the south lawn of the White House is considered part of the residence of the president at the White House, and much like the residence itself, can be used for political activity. And so we went forward with that, staging that event on the south lawn outdoors that you might have seen on television. So those were our primary sites that we built out. Was the Mellon Auditorium, Fort McNair, and the White House itself. I think that the convention turned out, I think, to be a fairly amazing television broadcast. I think the Republican convention was very compelling. The messaging, the sites, the visuals, the broadcast itself was really seamless, which is really a tribute to the production team that we put together on a very short notice. But the fact that it worked at all is really kind of amazing. And I think it was really great. I've been to many conventions. I know you have too, Bill. I think that was the 8th one that I've been a part of since 1988. So I'd often felt, and many other participants had, that a lot of the kind of the hoopla and the pomp and circumstance of the conventions was kind of outdated, right? All modern conventions, everybody knows who the nominee is going in. There's really not much drama, although we had a little bit in 2016 with Ted Cruz, but typically they're sort of non-events. The networks have consistently pushed back the number of hours that they're willing to broadcast for conventions, made their broadcast shorter and shorter. So, a lot of people had thought that, the idea of the typical convention was outdated. So, in the aftermath of this one, the campaign was very pleased by the way it turned out. The president was too. And a lot of us had discussions saying that this, very well could be the way that conventions are produced going forward. They're TV shows, right? That's what they always have been in the modern era. This was, we kind of did away with the crowds and the funny hats, but it was still, you were still able to get, many hours of compelling television broadcasts on the air, and it was, by the way, it was relatively cheap compared to the cost of staging conventions as they're typically done in these cities. I mean, we spent a lot of money, but it was nothing near what a typical host committee and committee on arrangements would have to spend.
Yeah. Well, Mike, you and I both had some interesting experience during the 96 Dole campaign with Bob Woodward. And he published his book, Rage, on the Trump administration on September 15th. And 3 days later, Justice Ginsburg passed away. How did those two events affect the campaign?
They really did a lot. The Woodward book, that was, it was a surprise. I think that a lot of the revelations and the, allegations that Woodward, put forth in his book, I think that the campaign wasn't particularly well prepared for a lot of it. There had been a lot, the president, as it turned out, the president had done had a lot of conversations with Woodward in the days and weeks and months leading up to its publication. So there was a lot of content in there, I think, that, we were not aware was coming at us. And in particular that, some of the allegations that were made about, supposed comments the president made about the military from, by the way, which were totally anonymous sources, which we can go off on that for another hour and a half about how that works in politics. But it was, obviously it was ill-timed. There was a lot of chagrin, within the campaign about Woodward's choice to withhold some of the, president's comments from the early stages of the pandemic and to publish them in this book, in October. Everybody in this business is always stealing themselves for the October surprise. And this, that's how this was kind of presented by the mainstream media, that this was the, that Woodward's book and some of the allegations in there was going to be the silver bullet, that would take out the Trump campaign. So, there was a very, very, very aggressive effort to get eyewitnesses, to that particular incident that Woodward had reported on, the president's comments about the military that he had made in Paris. It was relatively easy to find a number of eyewitnesses who could refute it and say that he never said such things. But it did, pulled out a lot of time and energy and effort out of the campaign at that late stage that was really not helpful. So I don't know, in the end, how much of a huge difference it made, because, there was anonymous sources. I'd never, I've been around the president a lot in the past 5 years. I'd never heard him speak like that about the military at all, ever one time. And neither had anybody else I've taught, I know or work with. He'd always had, the utmost respect for the military and had spoken nothing but positive about them. And I think that, he was held in very high regard by them. So the Woodward book obviously was, the timing was terrible. It was not helpful. And it did drain a lot of energy and, resources out of the campaign that was, unnecessarily having to respond to Woodward's allegations, which I assert were totally false. So then, you mentioned that shortly thereafter was the passing of Justice Ginsburg. So, one of the premises of the Trump 2016 campaign was his promise to appoint conservative judges, not just to the Supreme Court, but all the way up and down the judiciary. And that's you may recall that he had proactively released a list of potential names that he had, vetted, that we had vetted and that the president approved of, who could potentially be justices. And that was just prior to the 2016 campaign. So this is something, this topic had been around for quite some time and had been a core value, if you will, of the Trump campaigns and the Trump presidency. Not widely reported on and kind of widely misunderstood is the number of justices that the president had appointed and the below the Supreme Court. I think 220 some federal judges were appointed by the Trump administration, which are going to have an impact for a long, long period of time. So, the previous appointments, Gorsuch was relatively unscathed, but the kind of the fire and the fury of the Kavanaugh appointment had been a great education for those of us in the campaign and in the administration, that these appointments of these Supreme Court justices was not going to be rubber stamped by any means, right? There was the political forces on both sides were highly inflamed to get either a conservative appointed or not appointed. So we had learned a lot of lessons from the Kavanaugh period, and I think that many in the Senate, in particular, Lindsey Graham, that was a very, very difficult lessons for him and for others in the Senate about the lengths to which the opposition would go to try to prevent the president from successfully appointing Supreme Court justices. So the passing of Ginsburg, obviously was a tragedy. She was a great icon, great liberal icon, and a great, justice. But it was not unanticipated. So, I think that there was never any hesitation, I don't think, by the president, by this administration, or by the campaign, that we would, put forward a very aggressive effort to appoint a third, conservative justice. Again, that the impact of the Trump presidency on the judiciary, it's going to be very, very long, and it's been very deep. So, the opportunity for a president to appoint 3 conservative Supreme Court justices in one term is quite remarkable. It's really amazing, the timing of that. And I think it was really quite helpful from a political standpoint, because it really galvanized the conservatives in our base, that the president kept his promise to appoint conservative Supreme Court justices. I think, the way that Associate Justice Barrett conducted herself in the hearing was quite remarkable, and was really a great testament to, her intellect and wisdom. And I think it actually turned out to be quite a net positive, because, we were so forceful in their presentation of her and her credentials that it really kind of offset any negativity like we had seen in the Kavanaugh fight. So I think it was quite, the timing was quite remarkable, so close to Election Day, that I don't think anybody who knows Mitch McConnell should have been in doubt that he was going to, push it through. He knows exactly how many votes he had. He knew exactly how many he had the moment, that the nomination was put forward. He knew that he had the votes to confirm her. He never wavered from that. The president never did. So I think that, their steadfastness in pushing that through was quite remarkable. There's nothing there, there were precedents for appointing justices, close to Election Day. I don't think they cared either way, because they were going to get it done, and they did. So again, that one, the president obviously had a great nominee, but Mitch McConnell's ability to, harness the votes in the Senate is really unbelievable. He's really good at it, second only to Bob Dole, in my estimation. So he did a great job. And, I think it was really amazing outcome.
Yeah. Most interesting. You go into the end of September and into early October, you have the first debate. What was the campaign's assessment of the first debate?
Well, I might step back just a little bit, because, the Commission on Presidential Debates, we had, early on in actually like back in April and May, we had considered internally trying to come up with an alternative to the Commission on Presidential Debates. We, having gone through the debate commission process in 2016, we felt that they were not particularly even-handed. And there was one particular incident in the third debate, I believe, where there were some sound problems. And the president always felt that the commission, was biased against him, and that, it wasn't necessarily even-handed. We also did some research on, the members of the commission, and found that, the Democrats all on the commission were opposed to Trump, obviously. The Republicans who were on there also weren't great supporters. They were kind of old school establishment Republicans that weren't really, on the Trump train at all. So our assumption was that, the commission was biased against us, and they were not going to be even-handed. We also, even in April and May, we knew that the pandemic was going to have a significant impact on the ability to even have these events in person for a lot of reasons. One was obviously, having indoor crowds. The mitigations around that were going to be highly complex, extremely difficult. We also knew that the universities who host the presidential debates were suffering from, declining revenues, really brutal financial straits, and that it was extremely expensive to put these on. So we thought that was going to be a problem. We had entertained internally trying to come up with an alternative to debates, making a deal directly with the Biden campaign or coming up with some alternative for a much scaled down version of it. We never did proceed with that, but it did, our research into the kind of the makeup of the commission did give us great concern about how the debates were going to be held. The way that the debate commission is not a congressional charter. It's a 501c3 that kind of, through mutual agreement of the candidates, have the authority to put these events on. One of our primary concern actually was who the moderators were going to be, because if you start looking through across the choices available in the mainstream media, we felt 99.9% of the potential moderators were hostile to Trump, right? And were going to be problematical for us. But the moderators, as well as the sites, the format, and the moderators are all dictated to the campaigns by the commission. So again, all those things were problematical for us. So we went into the debate commission negotiations with a great deal of trepidation, I would say, and concern about those things, mostly about the moderators. So, they announced the moderators of the three debates. We didn't have a big problem with any of them. There were known quantities to us, obviously. And so that turned out in our, before the debates to be much less of a concern that we had. We also negotiated, extensively on COVID mitigation, how we were going to make it possible for both teams to be tested, for all the guests to be tested, the media to be tested. We greatly scaled back the number of participants from the campaign that were actually in attendance. We had, fixed advance teams that went to all three of them that were tested regularly. So, the mitigation and the safety factors actually ended up being quite robust. And I'll give the commission credit for putting those in place and enforcing them, because it actually worked out pretty well for the three presidential debates and the VP debate. But the first debate, the format of these debates are, they're suggestions. There's never been, but the president obviously went into the first one very aggressively, and it was his intention was to get as much time as possible and to try to dominate, Joe Biden like he had done in the previous debates. I went back and watched all three of the 2016 debates in great detail leading up to preparations for, doing the operations for this round, which I did. And, then Mr. Trump was actually quite good. Considering that he had debated very limited way. He had been in the primary debates, obviously, in 2015 and 16, but, to be on this stage, in that set of circumstances, he actually did extremely well in 2016. So that gave us a lot of confidence about his ability to, overperform this time, which I think he did. So we, again, I mentioned this before, the debate commission has, unilateral decision-making over the format and the, and the moderator. So they unilaterally made a decision that the second debate was going to be virtual. We didn't know anything about that until we saw it in the media. They announced it, I think, at like 5 a.m. In the morning after the first debate. There was no input from us at all, if that was acceptable to us or if we thought that was necessary. The president, he thrives on in-person events. I think he does extremely well when he has an audience to speak to. That's really part of his, it's been part of his success as a communicator. So the virtual debate, was really of no interest at all to us. It's not something we wanted to do. The other thing, if you may recall, there came out some opposition research on the moderator that showed that he had been, I think, an intern for Joe Biden and had some unfortunate tweets, and there's a bunch of folderol about the moderator. So in any case, we made the decision that the second debate was really not to our advantage to do virtually. And so the president declined to appear at that one. So the third, I think the next was the VP debate, which I thought the vice president performed exceedingly well, given the circumstances. I think he composed himself extremely well. I thought that was one of the best VP or presidential debates I've seen. It was really quite good. And then the third debate, obviously, the president was well prepared for that. I thought the moderator did a good job. The campaign thought so too. And that, it was really a pretty fair representation of the candidates at the third debate. I think it really was helpful probably to both candidates, but I thought it came off quite well. The timing, worked well. The format was good. So all in all, I think the third debate was really a net positive for us.
After the first debate, Mike, the president's positive test for COVID-19 was made public. That must have really sent shockwaves through the campaign.
It really did. That's a day I won't soon forget. The campaign headquarters is I mentioned this before, is in a Roslyn section of Arlington, Virginia, which is right over the Potomac River. And we actually have views you can see from our office conference room, the White House, part of the White House grounds. So I was sitting there with a group of my colleagues when we watched the Marine One take off from the White House and head up to Walter Reed Medical Center. Like, that was a very, very unsettling experience, because we really didn't know, what the outcome of that was going to be. Right? It was unprecedented for a president, I think, to fall ill at this point in a campaign, so close to the end of a campaign. Now I'll say this: one thing I've learned about Mr. Trump and President Trump is that the guy has an unbelievably high energy level. His ability to work, I've never seen anything like it. He sleeps 3 or 4 hours a night. He's on 110%, 20 hours a day. The guy is incredibly robust. So, that was a great, a great factor to us. We knew that, he was really strong as a person, and that he would have the best possible medical care. Going to Walter Reed, I think, Bill, you and I have had experience with that with Senator Dole. We know that the doctors, nurses there are the top notch. They're the best in the world. They're great people, serving their country. So the fact that the president had access to that, was of great comfort to all of us. So, just like the rest of the country, we prayed for the president. We knew that he would be strong and that he would have the best possible care, and that, all those things were true. So it was also, kind of interesting from a political, standpoint. He had, the treatment he received there was obviously quite effective. He recovered really in a remarkably rapid period of time, which, again, knowing him, it didn't surprise us. But and he was back on the campaign trail relatively soon. So, I think it was, again, it's it's not something you want for your candidate or the president to be not be well. But the way that he handled it, the way the hospital handled it, and the way he recovered, got back on the campaign trail relatively quickly, it was really pretty remarkable set of circumstances. And those of us who know him and Americans that know him know that he is not a quitter. The guy is a fighter. You can say what you will about him, but he does not give up. So we knew that he would fight his way through that, which he did in his typical fashion, and was back on the campaign trail relatively soon. And I think he was actually kind of renewed his energy on the trail, because, he could say that he had taken it on and beaten it, and that, you can too. And that was a lot of his messaging, after he had it and recovered from it, that it was yes, it was bad. It was a terrible thing for the country, but it can be beat and it can be overcome, and that he had done it. And I think, was very heartening for a lot of people.
Okay, going into the election, Vice President Biden had a pretty significant lead in the polls, and the mainstream media widely thought that he was going to score a big win. But like 2016, the results were a little bit different. How do you think why do you think the results were quite a bit closer than predicted?
That's a good question. I think that, the contrast between the two campaigns was so remarkable, right? We ran, I don't know, there probably has never been two presidential campaigns that were more different than these two, mostly because of the way that the candidates campaigned, or, did very limited campaigning, how there were only two debates, the amount of money that was, involved in both sides, both from the campaigns themselves and from the outside groups, was all, really unbelievable. So I think that there was a lot of, there was a lot stronger vote for the Congress and for the Senate. I guess it remains to be seen how the Senate will turn out. But the number of seats that were retained in the House, I believe every incumbent in the House was reelected, was really pretty amazing. I think that there was the voters, particularly on a mail-in, which is, all primarily mail-in election all over the country. I think that there was a lot more attention. People paid a lot more attention to their congressional candidates and their Senate candidates than they typically would have done in a normal circumstance. People were consuming a lot more media during the pandemic. I think that they got a lot more exposure to the candidates than they typically had done. We're paying closer attention. I mean, the turnout numbers were astronomical, right? Much higher than anticipated. So I think all of those factors led to that, outcome of the Republicans actually doing much better down ballot than expected. And the Democrats, the election itself the presidential election being closer than had been projected. And, I think that's one of the things about the Trump kind of era and the Trump movement is the inability of pollsters to poll the Trump voters. This is something I felt very strongly about for years. I think the pollsters are asking the wrong people the wrong questions. I think that there are, a lot of people who are Trump supporters or anti-establishment voters who were telling the pollsters wrong answers or lying to them, or that were, it became to be called the shy Trump voter, is what the mainstream media called it. But, that's something that we had always since the beginning had been part of our strategy. And I mean, back to the Iowa caucuses in 2016, was to try to target the high propensity Trump voters and the low turnout voters, people that hadn't voted, new voters, people that had voted and stopped voting, and try to get them to vote again. So I think amongst that group in particular has always been targeted incorrectly by pollsters, and so I think a lot of the methodologies just don't work on kind of a movement like Trump represents in the Republican Party in particular. Okay,
the president obviously is charged pretty widespread fraud, and that cost him the election. The media, the courts really aren't giving any indication that they're accepting that argument. At what point do you think the president decides to move on and perhaps concede, and or is this going to continue indefinitely?
I don't know the answer to that. I never, one secret to my longevity is that I never predict what the president is going to say or do. People
Probably very wise.
Yeah. So I can't, I can't really say what he's going to do. I know that, the Constitution dictates that a new president is sworn in on January 20th. I fully expect that to happen. I don't think, the president has always, I mentioned this earlier, the guy never gives up. He always fights to the very end. I don't think anybody that knows him or has watched him closely, particularly over the past several years, are surprised that he's going to exercise every legal opportunity that he has to make sure that every legal vote is counted and, illegal votes aren't. I think that, the circumstances, the legal strategies of the past several weeks is not particularly surprising. I think that, anybody who studied the, Bush versus Gore in 2000, I was in that campaign also, would know that, you have to pursue every possible legal strategy. And I think that's what he's doing. And he's also, he's always been a litigious person. And I think, and we've all, I've handled a lot of legal matters for the president. I'm not a lawyer, but I have overseen a lot of our legal strategies. So none of this is really particularly surprising. I think that there will be a president sworn in on January 20th, but between what happens between now and then, I'm not going to predict. But I think the president will persist until that time.
Yes. Okay. Many have expressed concern about the president's feud with Georgia Republican leaders, especially with the two runoff Senate elections coming up. Do you feel that losing those two seats could be damaging to the president's legacy?
I think it's very important to the country that those seats be won. I think that, the president the president just appeared, just prior to this interview. He was in Georgia for, again, a very large scale rally. The base of Trump supporters turned out for that. I think it had a huge, boost for the two Republican incumbent candidates there. I think it could be perceived as a confusing message for him to claim that there was malfeasance, in the November election, and that the Georgia, officials ran a poor election, and at the same time encouraging our voters to vote, to get out and vote in January. I think that's just the circumstances we're in. I don't know. I don't think, in retrospect, he would have done anything differently. I think that, you'll see all across our communications platforms, from the campaign to the Trump family, that we're encouraging Republicans to vote in Georgia, and that it's important to the future of the country that we win those seats. I think that, again, I really am not going to predict what impact that's going to have on his legacy. Obviously, we want to retain the Senate for the good of the party, the good of the country. And I think, there's a lot of very smart people there. The president, the White House, the campaign to the degree were supportive of those events. The Republican National Committee, we're doing everything possible to win those seats. We want to, and I believe we will. So again, I try not to project like what history is going to say, but I'm sure it'll have some impact on his legacy, but obviously we want to win it.
Okay. What would you, if you were going to identify, let's say, one or two main reasons for the outcome of the election, what would you point to? Well,
I'm not going to break any new ground here. I think they're probably obvious what those are. It's the the onset of the coronavirus, the pandemic. I think had a severely negative impact on the campaign and on the country, obviously. So I think dealing with that at the same time that the campaign was going on was very, very, very challenging. I think so that's quite obvious, particularly when you have a campaign that's predicated and based on these large scale, in-person events. That's been the basis of the Trump movement since the beginning. And when that, the ability to do that was taken away, for a period of time was very, very problematical. I think really hurt our momentum in many ways. I think the fundraising, the spending that was done early on in the campaign, particularly, this will be a question again for historians, but we spent a tremendous amount of money on digital and broadcast campaign ads during the pandemic, particularly during the early stages. And our polling and the thought process was that we needed to spend money then in order to shore up the president's standing during that period, which was very, very difficult period politically for us. So we spent a tremendous amount of money earlier than we normally would have done in a normal strategy. So if you jump forward to October, I think we could have had more money to spend in October. We would have been better off if we'd had that money that we spent then in October, but there was no way to know how that was going to play out. I think you can make the argument both ways. The spending early on was necessary in order just to keep our numbers above water, and the spending later may or may not have had a major impact at that point also. So I think that probably the reaction to the pandemic, the reaction to unrest in the streets, right? And that was again unprecedented, the amount of activity we saw in the streets and some of it violent. And then thirdly was again, the campaign spending. And I mentioned it before, the contrast in the way that the campaigns were run, I think was also unprecedented and very difficult to measure how that was going to impact the outcome.
Was there any thought in the campaign, Mike, that the pandemic could have been approached from a more politically sensitive point of view?
Again, I'm not going to criticize how the president addressed it. I think that we could have done a better job promoting the positive outcomes of his policies. I think a lot of that was kind of lost in the noise particularly of the fall. Again, it was the largest mobilization of government infrastructure since World War II to stand up and promote the access to PPE and to work with the states on mitigation and provide the resources that the states needed. I think that was done exceedingly well. I think right now we're seeing the outcome of Operation Warp Speed, the development of a vaccine in record time that was probably it will be one of the greatest public-private partnerships ever engaged in a very short period of time to producing a vaccine, which I think just is becoming available now in the UK and will be widespread. So I think probably our inability to support the positive work that the administration was done, or the inability to communicate that effectively was probably negative for us.
Okay. Last question today, Mike. We do appreciate you joining us, but I've saved one of the tough ones for last. I know you don't want to predict what the president's going to do. I understand that, but I have to ask you this question. 2024, do we see a rematch?
I think that is highly possible. And I think it's, I think the president has said that he's thinking about it. I think that's been reported widely. I think that he is. I think it would be very interesting if he does. So, I've pointed this out to some of my Democrat friends. I said, listen, you thought that, apparently Joe Biden is going to be the next president, although that's not, confirmed till he's sworn in, but apparently is. And if Trump runs again and wins again, you're going to extend the Trump era from 8 years to 12 years, probably an unintended outcome for them. But again, I'm not going to predict what he's going to do, but I wouldn't be surprised if he does.
Yeah. Mike Glassner, Chief Operating Officer of the Trump for President Committee. We really appreciate your time today. Thanks for being part of the Dole Institute Digital Post-Election Conference.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be with you. I love the Dole Institute. I'm really proud of what you've done. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Mike.